I'm Jerry Lawler, and tonight we're going to build a city. And we're going to do it in about 9.5 months. So everybody had a good dinner, because we got a lot of work to do. To sort of lay the groundwork first, it's sort of give you a description of what Lansing or this area looked like when it was pristine, before anything was here. And I'm using a map, but only for reference. The capital is here, Saginaw, St. Joe, and you also have a little map in the back of your packet. But basically, this was a very dense forest. And the forest was more dense on the west side of the Grand River as you went north, almost impenetrable. To give you an example how thick it was, one of the hotels was built down here by the Capitol. They basically cut the logs off, and used the stumps for a foundation. They were that thick. So that's what they built a hotel on. That was their foundation. So it gives you some idea. There was also lots of water. Basically where LCC is from Ionia Street, there's like an 83 acre. They called it a swamp. In today's terms, would basically call it a wetland. There were also lots of streams. Basically, Ottawa Street was a creek that ran down by the side of the Capitol. Basically started out by Martin Luther King, and where Ferris Park is now, there was another branch that fed into it. And where it connected, I don't know, but there's reference that it connected. There was also a stream in the north end, basically where the School for the Blind is, went down. There's also Alcock Creek on the east side that fed into the Grand River right about Saginaw with a little pool. There was also where Rudder Park is, that was a large stagnant pool of water. Also where the school administration building is. It took about 6,000 cubic yards to fill that hole in before they could build on it, give you some idea of what it was like. There was also where the new House Office building, the old Board of Water Light building, there was a pool in there. And right in the corner of Townsend, right across from the Capitol, it was more like a basement. The kids used to slide down the bank, let water collect in the wintertime. In the bottom of it, they'd slide down the hill. So, and the cloud west of the Capitol, they're basically talking about every 10 to 15 acres alternating between wetland, dry land, dry land, and there was a major swamp called Bogus Swamp out where basically Fisher Body Forge is now. So that was sort of what the area was like. And very briefly, when the land opened up for sale, it opened up for sale in the 1830s. It really didn't sell until 35 to 37. And the first one on your little sheet there basically shows you who the key players were in this area. And basically it was the Fords down south. They were businessmen from Jackson. They basically built the east side of Jackson. They come up, and we're going to build Vital City down here, which failed basically because of the recession. Then we had Seymour up in this area, Bushnell. Seymour ended up acquiring all the Bushnell land. Bushnell come up to this area, supposedly caught malaria here, went down to Louisiana and died. Seymour ends up with all his land, so we see Bushnell, basically to put Seymour's name in. So Townsend's owned down in the south end, basically land in the south end. So basically you got Seymour owning all the land and about almost 3 sides. Townsend's owning the land down here. Seymour was very interested in getting this area developed. In 1841, he hired Burchard, who was basically a businessman in Mason, who was an attorney, hired him to be his agent up here. He also sold him 109 acres up in North Lansing by the dam and going east from that dam. And he then petitioned the legislature for permission to build a dam because he wanted to build a sawmill. And 2 years later, he got that permission from the legislature. Then in 1843, he comes up, builds his cabin, builds his dam, moves his family up. And then the next spring, part of the dam washes out. I think everybody knows the story. He drowns trying to fix it. Didn't find his body for 10 days. He died on his 3rd wedding anniversary. Long story short, his family moves back. Seymour obtains the land back again. He hires a page, Joab, it's J-O-A-B, however you want to pronounce it, who lived down the other side of Mason. He brings his 3 son-in-laws in, and they expand the cabin, and they fix the dam, build the sawmill. The sawmill is not profitable. If you can't get the lumber out of here, it costs too much to get it out. So that's sort of where we are when the legislature in 1847 is meeting down in Detroit. We're not going to get into that. It's a long story as to how they made the decision. But basically, it was a massive anti-Detroit bias. Anti-Detroit bias is nothing new. It goes right back to the founding of this state. There's also the big pushers of the move up here was Mr. Bush, Charles P. Bush, Peck. They happen to be the President of the Senate, Speaker of the House. They own massive tracts of land in Livingston County. And of course, locating, they weren't particularly set on this site, but any place here or north of them, they were all for. And they could put the votes together for here. So Lansing, in mid-March, Lansing Township was designated the site of the new capital, no specific spot. They immediately took section 16 off, which is right around the Capitol, the blank right in the center of your first page there, because that was in the ball play as to where they were going to build it. The other, they passed a companion bill at the same time that basically said there would be 3 commissioners to select the site of the new Capitol, and 1 out of the 3 would be the acting commissioner. And the commissioners were to come here, solicit all proposals from the developers, select the best one, then the other 2 commissioners, they were done. But the acting commissioner was James Glenn from Cass County, and he was an engineer, civil engineer, and worked on the Sioux Canal. He was chosen to be the acting commissioner, and it was his job, after they selected the site, that he was to arrange to build the temporary capitol and the governmental buildings. They also took the school site off, and basically they were done. As soon as they announced that Lansing Township would be site of the new capitol, there immediately was a rush to Lansing. Everybody wanted to get in. These were opportunist developers, people who were willing to build a new capitol building. Mr. Silver, who was a state land commissioner at that time, was in Marshall. He immediately headed for Lansing, because under state law, he was charged with laying out any new town on state land. It wasn't the building commissioners, it was the land commissioner. So it was his job to plat the city and get it on the market. There's also a story well known that as soon as they named the site, out in the whole area, a whole group of guys got together, cut down the largest tree they could find, hooked every ox and horse onto it, and drug it up here to North Lansing for the new Capitol building. And Mrs. Aldridge writes an account where she has to stitch new breeches for her husband because he fell off the tree so many times he wore out the seat of his breeches. So there was also a sleigh group of people come in from Jackson, probably a good time to do it, but they came to look over the new Capitol building. Also, it's probable that James Glenn, the acting commissioner, came in here immediately before the other commissioners. The only way for some things to fall logically into place is that had to happen. And there is a story, several accounts of it, about a Reverend Blades, who basically from the Shiawassee circuit, these are circuit riding ministers, came in, and he immediately comes to Lansing. And he comes to the Page cabin down here by the dam, and he starts out, says, where's the school section? Mr. Page points him to the school section. So he goes up following the old survey marks, and he basically goes to the site where the current Capitol building is now situated. And he's sitting there contemplating the area, and he says, I sat down on a log and was taking in the scenery, and remember well the thought that passed through my mind. It is too bad to destroy such scenery as this, too bad to build a babbling town and break this silence and mar this scene so beautiful and so grand. So he's sitting there contemplating this, and along comes Mr. Glenn, and they talk and decide that where the Capitol was, we sort of lose that perspective today. But here, as I mentioned, you had a creek running down Ottawa Street, you had water right by its side, and it was elevated. It was actually sloped up. It's been filled in so much now we sort of lose that perspective. But basically, that was the highest point.
Where the Capitol is.
Yeah, where the current Capitol is. So they, Blade stakes out, and they drive a stake, basically, in the center of the rotunda, what is now the center of the rotunda. Blade then takes Glenn back to the Page cabin, and they have a prayer service. They eat, and then they have the first prayer service. And then Glenn must have gone back to Jackson. Okay, the only way it works out is he did that. Silver is here by that time. The governor had appointed 3 commissioners. One of them backed out because he's taken off to leave the state. The other 3 come by train up to Jackson on April 4th or April 5th. Not positive which date, one of those dates, because it took them 3 days to get here. It took them 2 days to get from Jackson to Mason, and it took them a day to get from Mason here. And Mr. Weller, who was within the party, described it basically at Mason, the bridge over the Sycamore Creek was washed out, so they cut down a tree and they floated across to the other side on this tree. Well, one of the commissioners, Mr. Smart, was a Scotsman and apparently had a pretty bad vocabulary. He was not going to trust his body to doing that, so he refused to go across that way. So they had to stop and build a raft to raft him across, to get him across so that before they could go on. And then they drove the horses through the raging torrent to the other side. And then it took them a full day to get here. And they ended up at the Page cabin. They held their first meeting on April 7th. And basically at that point, they elected Glenn, who was already, the governor had already elected as the chairman of the commissioners. And they also elected James Platt, who was the Secretary of the Senate, as the clerk for the commissioners. So he came within the party too. So basically what happened from the end of April is they sat and took proposals. And there were several players in the game. And if you look at the second page of your sheet there, we're not going to get into these in great detail. But if you look in the second sheet there, you remember they could build the Capitol any place in Lansing Township. So they looked, starting from the top, Gilkey was one of presenting a proposal, and basically this is out the Grand River where it splits off to go down to Tecumseh Park. That's about out in that area. He was a major player. Seymour obviously was. He actually submitted the proposal to the legislature. So he wanted 2 sites. He wanted the Capitol in North Lansing on the east side of the river. That's where he wanted it bad. He later dropped back his position on either side of the river, any place in the north end. We also had, was one of the most interesting ones, is where the 7-Eleven store is now out in East Lansing, where Michigan Avenue and Grand River meet. That was a site under consideration. Basically, the sheriff of Wayne County was involved in that little group, as well as others, trying to get, some things don't change. You basically have people coming here to make money. Section 16, which the state owned, which the school section was in play, and then the towns basically had the 2 sections down to the south end. They were never seriously in play. And pretty obviously right from the start, basically because of the land along the river was swampy, whatnot, wasn't elevated, pretty much they weren't in. So the real players was Gilkey, and basically he went back and they started out saying, we'll give you 20 acres, the state will give you 20 acres, we'll help build your buildings, if you put your capital here, then the next one would raise it, saying, well, I'll give you 40 acres, and I will build your buildings, and Gilkey go back, say, I'll build them out of brick for nothing, there won't be any cost to the state, I'll give you 80 acres, and they just kept going back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. So finally Seymour was up to over 200 acres he was going to give to the state if they would locate it there. Basically what the state did was there was a group, and you got Seymour and his group up here, you got Townsend, you got Bush, who was the president of the Senate, Peck, who was Speaker of the House. Others were basically all working with the Townsends at the other end. Okay? So what they did is put together a proposal and said the Townsends will give the state every third, will give you 1/3 of the land down on the east half of section 21 if you put the Capitol in the center, north-south center line of the school section. We'll build a bridge over the Grand River at Main Street, no cost to the state. You can take anything you want off our land to build the Capitol building or any other state building. And then some Bush and some of the others got together and threw in a few thousand, says, we'll put this money in toward clearing the streets. Okay? So that's the proposal the commissioners accepted. Well, so they ended up the best of both worlds. They had their own land right around the Capitol's going to be built. plus they got a third of this, plus they got a bridge, plus they got several other things. So the next thing they did was they had to get the thing surveyed and laid out. And they started in April, and basically by the June 23rd, they were done. And you also have this in your packet, but this basically is the first plan of Lansing. And what the proposal was, is the commissioner's seen it, working with Silver, is a permanent capital would be where it is right now. That was from day one. The 6 blocks of land in front of it would be a state park, would be a park. Very natural park. They'd just leave the trees where they were, clear out the underbrush, and they would have a beautiful park at no expense. Where Ferris Park is, and where the school administration building is now situated, they were going to withhold that for public institutions, or if they didn't build public institutions, they would be used for parks. Now what they were talking about was an insane asylum. That was what was on the hit list in 47 and 48. That was what the state needed. They built the prison, they were ready to build an insane asylum. And that's what they called it, insane asylum. And we lost, of course, to a little town down the road. But that's what they were holding these lots for. The street, I know we've driven by there, we do it every day, and we don't look at what the streets are and what they mean. But very clear what they were doing. The first major streets was Michigan and Capitol, running right in. Then the next 2 streets ran for the developers. Okay, Seymour agreed to put in half of his section into the new town. Townsend's agreed to put in half of theirs. So you've got Townsend and Seymour Street running respectively to theirs. And you've got to remember, when you get into the names and how we get into the upper and lower towns, is you got to remember all this time people are still pouring in here. Just pouring in. They know where the capital's going, but they can't get at the land. So where the development is going on is down along Main Street and Cedar Street here, to St. Joe's the dividing line. So they're piling up as close to this boundary as they can get. And also up here in the north end, around Seymour's Mill and Dam. So that's how come we're getting the upper and the lower town, but they can't get into the center. So we're getting as close as we can. The next streets are in the state is basically all the tree streets. As you go through, tree streets, tree streets, tree streets, okay? And then in the state section, basically from St. Joe to Saginaw, we have counties. Just like Washington, D.C. is named after state, has the state streets, we have the county streets, all the way across on the state-owned land. Now, what the rationale is and why they chose these counties, I can't figure it out. It wasn't the people who voted to move the capital to Lansing, it wasn't Native American names or anything like that. The only rationale, logic is, it goes across the bottom of the state, back and forth, and these are the counties in 47. The only logic for that is just keep going over and up, over and up. It's the only logic. Why, I still haven't figured out why they chose them counties. If anybody's got an idea, let me know. The next streets they did was you had Main Street and you had Center Street. Going to be the two. This was the Townsend's development. This was Seymour's development. That were the 2 streets there. Then the Townsends named their streets after members of the family. Now, some of these have been changed, but basically their streets over in that area are all named after family members.
Examples?
Pardon?
Examples of that?
Sure. You've got William, Elazer, Hubert. A lot of these have been changed. No longer. Elizabeth is now what was South Washington once you cross the river. At that time it was Elizabeth as they platted out. Lee Street was another one, but they were all originally named after families. Okay. Seymour, we have Washington, of course. Washington was heavily revered at this time on Main Street after him. Seymour named him after Madison, after certain politicians. And Kilbourne, who was his agent, Kilbourne was a state rep in 47 when they moved the capital to Lansing. Seymour immediately went out and hired him as his agent in North Lansing. He was actually from Meridian area. He came in and was basically selling and working for Seymour. So Kilbourne Street was named after him. Then we have certain function streets. Mill Street, from day one, and that's where Sawmill was going to go for the capital. And then you have Factory Street up in the north end. You have Ash, because an ashery was started almost immediately. They're burning the logs, so they had an ashery. Wall Street, obviously, for the financial institutions, and several others. So basically, that was the street naming system. They also had to get this place surveyed or assessed. And under state law, it had to be 3 Ingham County residents that had to do the assessing. So Silver went out and got the sheriff, got the probate judge, and an ex-legislator to come in and do the assessing. And rather amazing, this assessment book still exists. And basically, this would give you the color code. We're not getting into this, but basically the orange is from $1 to $999. That's what they assess the whole block for. They assess each individual lot, basically the whole block into 3 that much. The purple basically 1,000 to 2, the green 2 to 3,000, and the red right across from the Capitol, the temporary Capitol, was 3,000 plus. Okay, and pretty much, you know, the heart of downtown as we know it today. So we've got all that going on, and we flip on ahead to the May. This is all going on. How people are still rolling in here. Basically, about the 1st of May, we got the Powells and the Bushes moving in, Oliver Bush, and he was brought in basically to build Seymour's Hotel down here, which was at the corner of basically Grand River and Center Street, originally called Seymour's and later Franklin House. So that's going on. And Mrs. Powell comes in, and she describes sleeping in a temporary building that was put up, and I think by Smith Tucker, who was one of the original bridge builders here. And she talks about 60 people sleeping in it. And basically they were sleeping on the ground, but they had shelter over them when they got here. Now Mrs. Powell immediately starts teaching the school sometime around the 1st of May. And this was basically a shanty, had leather hinges, no windows, and basically up where the original Cedar Street School still is today. And that was the first public school here. Interesting, Peck, the Townsends are sort of starting to get out of the area, and basically in May they also sell 1/3 of their land, an interest in their land, to Peck. And he was the old speaker of the House. He was also appointed the postmaster, even though the post office didn't exist yet. He was appointed. Glenn on May 8th puts out proposals to build the new Capitol, soliciting materials and a contractor to build it. George Matthews starts building the bridge. He's the county treasurer. He starts building the bridge across the Grand River at Main Street. And on May 23rd, Bush and Thomas, Bush again was president of the Senate. Thomas and Lee were businessmen from Howell area, Livingston and Oakland County. And basically they came in and started opening stores. And the Bush and Thomas store was the first store to open. And that was located right in the corner of Main and Cedar Street. It was on the southwest corner, key spot. And there was a hotel, Clapsaddle was putting up a hotel opposite. It had to have been some kind of a rough shanty board type of affair. And Mr. Hunt is putting up one which would have been on Main Street and River Street, in the corner on the other side of the river, all at the same time. And on May 1st, we have what I call the Woodstock event in Lansing. That's when the commissioners formally announced that where they're going to build the permanent Capitol. And supposedly everybody rushes to the site and they have the first ball game. Clear an area of underbrush and they play ball. And as you go through the different histories, there's more people who were at this ball game, and they weren't there. We know it because some weren't even in Lansing at the time. But that was the first ball game in Lansing. So we have the surveying continued and the praising continued, and that rolls us into June. And in June 3, Commissioner Glenn, he issues a contract to Benjamin Porter from Jackson to build the Capitol building. And why he ever gave the contract to this guy, I have no idea. Because Porter had the contract to build the state prison in Jackson and gets kicked off the project basically for incompetence, mingling money. There was investigations by the legislature, and this thing drags on for years. He committed a lot more state resources, spent money that he didn't have. The state has to go in and basically pay because he had committed to it in the state's name. They turn right around and give him the contract for the Capitol. And you don't have to be a genius to figure out what's going to happen. Same thing. Suits drag on for years after the Capitol's over. June, again, people are rushing in. I can read you a long list of names, but basically Darling's come in. He's from Eaton Rapids. He immediately comes in and buys a lot across from where the temporary Capitol is. And Commissioner Glenn selected basically where the back of Cooley Law School is now. It was on the, it actually faced Washington Street, but it's at way back. And so where the back end of Cooley Law School is now, the old Masonic Temple, that's where the original Capitol actually sat. And we know the lots where it sat on, but that's where it sat. And they, of course, they're coming in and start building across right away. Carter comes in and starts building right across from there. Darling comes in and is building a bakery and a grocery. Gearing is starting to build a hotel. He's the one that just used the stumps for his foundation. Because again, they're just, you know, they're just coming in and going to town. So all this is going on at the time. Rolls into July, and on July 4th, they have a big celebration. Hunt in the Michigan Exchange. This is the hotel that was built on a river and Main Street. They have a ball. They have a big celebration down at the corner of Washington and Main Street. And this is where Bush and Thomas and Lee are building a brick hotel. Because already at this point, we have a brickyard already started up on the east side of the river toward the north end. So they're already making brick here. And he's building a big hotel. They were Democrats, so they named it the Benton Hotel after Senator Benton. And they were off and running. And this was all done a little ahead of the Seymour Hotel in North End. The major development initially was down at Main and Cedar Street. That's where the main concept. They're also starting to get in. Peck speaks at the celebration down in the grove, or under the trees there. Congregational church is organized on the 7th. They start to get religion and liquor in. They have a big fight over liquor. Surprise. The Turner House in the North End, originally James Turner comes up from Mason. He's a businessman there, has a store. He buys lots 9 and 10 on Turner Streets, and he starts building, some say the first frame house, a real frame house in Lansing. He has the shingles carted up from Mason over the Hog's Back, and it is, the pictures of it, it is a nice looking house, just sketches of it. But that's starting to develop up there. We also have a letter from Mr. Smith, wrote his father, that he'd come into Lansing. And just to give you some idea of what it took to get in here, now this is in July 13, he wrote. And he took a train from Detroit to Dexter, which is 50 miles. It took him 5 hours on the train to get the 50 miles. That's 10 miles an hour. Then at Dexter, he got a wagon to Mason. Not a stage, but a wagon. And it took 9 hours to go 38 miles. Then at Mason, he got another wagon to Lansing for 75 cents, and it took him 5 hours to get from Mason to Lansing. Mrs. Powell, remember, she had started the school up here in May. By July, she's got 40 students. She started out with 8. By July, she's got 40. Case and Smith are also coming in. And we have, there's a newspaper account, Michigan Marshall Expounder notes that there are about 30 buildings now in Lansing, and they're being built at the rate of 2 or 3 a day. So this kind of feverish activity continues up until December, and they actually haul the books up on wagons. They take them, bring them up on the train to Marshall, then on wagons up to Lansing. And one, they work out a horse so bad carrying the library books that he drops dead on Main Street, and the state ends up paying $75. Okay. That's the end of the tape. We're going to go on from there. Okay.